Welcome to the Feonix Insider, your all-access pass to the stories shaping the future of mobility and health equity. Each episode, we dive into real-world challenges and innovative solutions that impact transportation access in communities across the country. From candid conversations with industry leaders to first-hand accounts from the individuals we serve, the Feonix Insider gives you a front-row seat as we work toward creating mobility solutions for the health and well-being of every person in every community. Join us on this journey as we pave the way for a more equitable and connected world.
Welcome to the show, everyone. I am so excited to have Peter Appel, Managing Director of Logistics Capital and Strategy, LLC, with us here today on the Feonix Insider. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thank you very much, Valerie.
All right, a little about Peter before we begin. Peter has more than 30 years of leadership and consulting experience in transportation across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He served as the administrator of the U.S. Department of Transportation's Research and Innovative Technology Administration, where he led major safety initiatives along with research and development on technologies to advance transportation safety, sustainability, and efficiency. He is currently managing director with Logistics Capital and Strategy, an Arlington, Virginia-based consulting firm that works with companies across the transportation sector. He has served extensively as an advisor to investors and infrastructure funds on the acquisition and operational improvement of transportation companies, such as railroads, airlines, trucking companies, ocean shipping terminals, and other assets. Peter is also a member and an officer of Feonix Mobility Risings. So excited to have you on the show, Peter. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. It's great to discuss transportation.
Well, so as we get started, Peter, I always like to ask this first question to folks. What's your story? Like, where did you grow up? What was your first job? How did you even get into this transportation world?
Well, I grew up in Urbana, Illinois, near the campus of the University of Illinois. My father was a professor there for 30 years. So much about my growing up was revolved around the activities of that university. So, for example, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, University of Illinois was really on the forefront of developing computer technology at that time. And so as a high school student, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time working with computers on campus, which, in 1979, 1980, I had the opportunity to be a junior year abroad student at the London School of Economics. I was an economics and computer science double major undergrad, but that year I decided to focus on the economics. And there was a wonderful year-long course at LSE called the Economics and Geography of Transport. And I took it. It was led by probably one of the top transportation economists of our time, Sir Christopher Foster, who was a senior official in the British government, as well as being a professor at the LSE. And I learned a lot about the underlying theory of transportation investment, network optimization, and the like. And I kind of got so hooked on it, I decided I'd do my graduate work in that field. And a lot of the reading list for what I studied in London was written by folks at MIT. So that's where I decided to go to grad school to focus more on that field.
So after MIT, what was that first next job into the transportation sector?
My first transportation job was for Amtrak. I was, a lot of my graduate work was studying, optimization of pricing from the perspectives of the airline yield management, revenue and optimization. Big airlines like American Airlines were on the forefront of understanding the true value of an airline seat to a passenger. So that was a lot of folks coming out of graduate programs like I came out of, went to places like American Airlines or FedEx or whatever. But I was probably a bit of an idealist, and I decided that the Amtrak probably needed the help more. So I went down, got a job in the marketing department at Amtrak, and ended up being a head of pricing at Amtrak, trying to bring more analytical rigor to how Amtrak made decisions about fares across its network.
That must have been fascinating. Like when you jump into, at least for me, when jumping from, graduate work into the workforce where I could really sink my teeth into and apply what I learned, it fueled my passion for the industry so much more.
Yeah. So it was a great experience. It was, there was a lot to do. There were, again, comparing it to a place like American Airlines, which might have, 100 analysts looking at this kind of thing, there were just a very small number of us doing that kind of work at Amtrak.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So let's talk just briefly about Feonix. As a board member, you've been serving on the board a number of years. I'll never forget the first time that you presented for Feonix when we were, as a board, trying to figure out what our strategy was and the path forward and how we could make a big difference in the world and in the United States and kind of where some of the things that as an organization we should be focusing on. And I'm just so thankful that conversation brought us together and you've been supporting Feonix for a number of years. What aspect of Feonix's mission do you think resonates most personally for you, Peter?
I think it's really about providing consistent access to mobility to allow underserved populations to effectively participate in our economy. And that's kind of, I've been involved in public policy and interested in public policy all my life. And almost everything I believe in is about just ensuring that individuals in society have the opportunity to succeed. We can't make them succeed, but we can ensure that, two kids born the same day, one in an affluent area and one perhaps in a much, much less affluent area, at least grow up to have the same chance to succeed in our economy.
And that economic mobility, I think that's concept of the zip code, having some of the most significant challenges or can, most accurately in terms of many scientific studies determine how long you're going to live. And if you do not have the mobility to get where you need to go, education, healthcare, work, I mean, that's a huge issue that we navigate every day is getting folks to the best job that they possibly can. And that car is, whether being driven or driven themselves, is a huge, or the most important factor in that conversation. All right. So let's dive in. So we talked about kind of where your history is started in the transportation industry. How can, thinking about your work at the federal level and working with various different private sector companies that intersect with all the regulations and aspects of oversight that come into these areas. So from your perspective, Peter, how does federal, state, or even local government better use data to make more effective transportation investment decisions?
I mean, it's an incredibly good question. And I think about that question from my perspective as someone who has spent a few years in the federal sector, in the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, but the vast bulk of my career has been in the private sector. But in both worlds, I was heavily involved in how do entities make decisions about how to invest their money in transportation. That's kind of the common thread of what I've done. And it was very eye-opening. For example, the time I spent around 2009 when the Tiger Grant program was, one of the largest, probably the largest discretionary grant program that had been launched at US DOT, similar to programs all across the government at that time coming out of the economic crisis that year, and looking at how investment decisions were made and the limited role I played in that, because RITA, the agency I had, was not a grant-making agency, but we were involved. I mean, it was not, I should say, it was not as big a grant-making agency as the Federal Highway Administration or the Federal Aviation Administration. We gave grants, but not at the scale as some of the bigger agencies. But the role that I played sometime was to try to get a little bit more analytics into the process whenever I could. And what I sensed was there's a lot more opportunity to put analytical rigor in making decisions about how to invest the next $50 million. If you take $50 million that a private equity firm might invest in, perhaps they've just recently bought a logistics company and they're deciding how to invest $50 million to construct new warehouses or railroad access or whatever. And you compare that to a $50 million that the federal government might invest on some new transportation project associated with a discretionary grant. In my observation, the level of scrutiny, the level of analytics that private sector entity puts into deciding how to spend that $50 million is dramatically stronger, dramatically more rigorous. And a lot of private sector entities get a lot more for their buck because of scrutinizing those investments with good data, with a good understanding of what the impact would be of investment. So when I think back about when I compare how a private sector and private public sector make decisions, and I think about best practices that particularly public sector entities can have, it really comes down to the core of the investment. The first thing you want to do when you're saying, hey, we should invest in this particular access capability in this community. Understand specifically what's the objective of the investment. Is it to provide less congestion, more access? Is it to provide beauty? That's for example, sometimes a lot of projects are justified because, like the Boston Central Artery 30, close to 40 years ago. Yeah, it relieved congestion through downtown Boston, but it was also a beautification project. It took this big ugly expressway and took it away and replaced it with something that had more capacity and was underground. And so I don't take away from beauty as being an objective, but if beauty is an objective or congestion relief is an objective or safety is an objective, you should start out by saying, okay, which are the most important objectives here and what are we going to accomplish? Because if you want to accomplish an environmental improvement, it might not push the ball as far as you might want to on congestion relief, or vice versa. If you purely wanted to reduce congestion, it might not push the ball as far as you want on environmental.
Right.
And it's okay to have those priorities, decide what those priorities are, but the important thing is determine what those priorities are up front, because that's where the data comes in. If your objective is to improve safety, you have to understand what the safety issue is. You have to go to the safety data sets and review them. If your objective is to reduce congestion, you have to understand the congestion data. If your objective is environmental beautification or reduce the carbon footprint, you have to understand the underlying data behind that. All too often, I see some of those objectives being looked at from a very big picture qualitative perspective, when there really is data underneath to understand truly what the current situation is, and particularly how you can change that situation when you make that investment. So looking at all those things with an analytical lens is very important, and that's certainly how the private sector generally does it, because the private sector really does have very specific analytical metrics of success. I would argue that the analytical metrics for success are just as important in the public sector, and we should pay just as much attention to them.
Absolutely. It goes back to this quote that, what gets measured gets done. And I think it's so interesting when you think about that factor from the federal government or state government or local government, and trying to put a quantitative or quantitative factor on investment decisions. Sometimes these government entities don't have research arms that at least at the local level. Many times cities and counties don't have R&D who determine, okay, we've got $700 million. They'll hire a consulting firm in many cases, if they're a larger community, to help figure out what is that next step. But at that, like, funding out the door part of that conversation, you're right, as many times there's not the same amount of rigor in deciding which aspect needs to be done, or even which aspect are we looking at, or do we need to look at with a different lens, is where that kind of environmental justice comes, and understanding where and how we frame investments in air quality, investments in emission reduction technology. I think that was my first understanding of the freight industry, was working on some EPA, Warner Enterprises and Crete Carrier, some of these global companies. And we're saying, how do we reduce the amount of emissions that is going into communities or areas where their warehouses are? And I think one of the key elements that really was like the factor of saying, yes, we want to invest in this, was this understanding of not only will it reduce emissions in those communities, but it will also save us money on the bottom line by putting certain technologies. It will reduce fuel consumption, so on and so forth. And so I think trying to have more conversations within the private sector with those local elected officials in those communities, or state elected officials. I mean, we're in our state legislature for about 8 months. That was enough for me. But it was fascinating how conversations based on informal understanding dictated how things got done versus going back to that report or going back to the analysis. So very fascinating. So, all
I
right.
think you used the term funding out the door, and it brought back a memory of those days in the Tiger Grant program where we really were trying to spur economic growth. And so I understand the rationale for it, but I was always a bit concerned about the primary metric every week. The primary metric of that program every week was obligated funds. In other words, how much funding did we send out the door last week? And I understand why that was the metric, because federal funding, has a time limit, and if you don't spend it, it might go away. And in particular, when you're trying to do economic stimulus, it's very important to get the money out the door. At the same time, it was very concerning to me because, to me, getting $50 million out the door is nowhere near as important as getting the most bang for your buck in spending that $50 million. And there are just untold examples of how the government has spent that $50 million and hasn't gotten the value that somebody else could have gotten for that. And that, to me, is one of the things I most want to change about government, is to put the emphasis more on the value delivered as opposed to just spending the money. Because very simply, to this day, the private sector still gets dramatically more value for its investment in a lot of those kinds of investment than the public sector does.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we talked a little bit about data. From your perspective and experience, Peter, what sources of data should transportation professionals or elected officials working with transportation professionals be aware of, and why, from your experience?
Well, the primary constituent of the public sector is the public. And so understanding the details about the public, who people are, where do they live, what jobs do they do, etc., are the first source of data. So places like the U.S. Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the first place I start, totally unrelated to transportation. Before you even get into a transportation decision, you want to understand the fundamental population dynamics. What is the population growth of the area you're looking to invest in? That's certainly what a investor in any other field would do. Is this a growing area? If I'm going to invest in Kodachrome film, is the film industry growing or is it shrinking? If I'm going to invest in a hot community, is that a growing community? Is that a shrinking community? Is it faster growing? So the Census Bureau is probably where I'd start on a lot of things. And the beauty of the Census Bureau, I mean, it is a national treasure. We invest a ton of money in data. The public sector invests more money in data at the Census Bureau than pretty much almost any other place. And yet, to me, I believe that census data is not used anywhere near as much as it could be in making decisions. I remember, Valerie, I told you when I first joined the board a couple of years ago, my wife works at the Census Bureau, and she was involved in developing a tool called the Census Business Builder, CBB.
Yep.
And that tool was about what I'm talking about, which is if you want to open Valerie's restaurant in some community, and you're trying to figure out whether you should go into debt and build this building and hire staff, you can go to this tool and understand of the population. Are the people that live there kind of people that would patronize the restaurant? If you're going to have a certain type of food, appeals to certain ethnic groups, you can understand the groups, you can understand income levels in the community, you can understand the growth rates, the growth rates of particular very small geographic components of the community. There's a wealth of data out there that's been underutilized for decades and decades. Examples of online tools like CBB, which you can Google and look up, it is designed to get it so you don't need to be a data professional to figure out how to tap to that kind of wealth of data that's available. So that's the first.
Yeah.
When you're making a transportation decision, make a decision. A restaurant would make a decision. Understand the community, understand the dynamics of the community, how it's growing, how it's changing. The next source, again, non-transportation source, Bureau of Labor Statistics. Understand, and that's certainly relevant to what we do at Feonix, understanding
Absolutely.
what type of jobs are growing. Are they healthcare jobs? Are they blue-collar jobs? Are they warehouse jobs? Are they the kind of jobs that tend to be more focused in an urban center or tend to be more rural in nature? Bureau of Labor Statistics has got tremendous data down to very, very detailed civic jobs, types and subtypes. Um, so that's kind of the non-transportation data. Transportation data, that's certainly what I lived and breathed. And when I was at DOT, overseeing Bureau of Transportation and other programs, Bureau of Transportation Statistics is a wonderful website to go to understand, for example, commodity flow data. This gets back more into what I do for a living in the private sector, where I deal much more with freight transportation than passenger transportation. The commodity flow survey, which is done periodically, can really help understand what all those trucks are moving, what the freight flow is, not just coming into the ports on the West Coast and the East Coast, but going over our roads. If you want to understand, what kind of truck transportation is going to be traveling through Nebraska, and what different commodities and what their origins are, what their destinations are, extremely relevant to a lot of different types of transportation decisions. It could be
Absolutely.
relevant for economic growth in any state in our country. If you know the changes in freight flows coming through your state, you know what potential investments you could make to attract
Mhm.
industry in that state. So Bureau of Transportation Statistics, freight flow data, that's like TS. And in 2009, we recognized that distracted driving was going to be an issue, and there were examples of this around the country, but it wasn't a crisis yet because smartphones weren't as prevalent yet.
Yeah.
But we knew it was coming, and we launched a major initiative on distracted driving. I led the Distracted Driving Summit in 2009 and 2010, and there was huge focus at the US DOT on what do we do to prevent distracted driving. And it got into um, messaging, it got into enforcement, it got into legislation and the like. There was a myth, for example, you couldn't enforce distracted driving laws. It's hard to enforce them. You have relatives in law enforcement people are smart. They figure out how to enforce things. And yes, we had police officers up there explaining exactly how you could be successful in enforcing distracted driving laws. Well, there was a tremendous focus on it those years when Ray LaHood was Secretary of Transportation, 2009, 10, 11, 12. If you look back at the last few years, I would say this country's lost focus on it, and that traffic fatality rate, which had been going down year after year, has finally started to go up, which to me is extremely disturbing. And folks argue, well, we're not sure those are distracted driving related. Well, that gets back to the data integrity issue. So this is a very long answer to a question about data integrity, but it really is a data integrity issue because really the tools to understand whether a crash was caused by someone on a cell phone are still not there yet. That if a police officer asks if someone was using a cell phone, you're not going to get a good answer on that, which means you have to use much more sophisticated data techniques to understand, whether a cell phone whether distraction was an element. There are plenty of researchers looking at how to do it, and no one has cracked the nut yet. And yet, without us truly understanding the dramatic role distracted driving has played in causing this incredible improvement in safety to turn in the other direction in recent years, uh, if we don't crack that nut, it's going to continue to get out of hand. So that's an example of data integrity problems costing lives in this country, and we need to find ways to fix it.
Yeah, I really respect and appreciate that emphasis and that focus. And I think I remember the naturalistic driving study that was done where they put cameras in hundreds of cars to just monitor, and the recordings that they have been able to capture and understand, like, and that was maybe what, 8, 9 years ago, maybe 10 years ago when that was done. I can't even imagine what that would look like today if they were to try and recreate, what is happening inside of these vehicles. And then you add this sexy excitement of autonomous vehicles. Oh, my car's going to drive itself. And you almost become even less inclined to like pay attention, especially if you have like lane avoidance and things like that. It's really easy to be like, oh, I'm just going to finish this text message while I'm sitting here waiting for my, and then next thing you know, you're gone. And I remember the ads that started to come out in the United States, and Europe even took it further. I mean, if you watched some of those distracted driving commercials that the Europeans were playing, like, you just sit down in your car, it got your attention very quickly. And I think also in the US, depending on the state you were in, they were very progressive about how do we compete for people's attention. And then there started getting college sports involved, like in Nebraska, behind every sports thing that, don't text and drive, click it or ticket. They're trying to figure out what are those conversations. But you're right. In the past 5, 6 years, I think with the pandemic and everything else, all that just kind of got like there's no conversation about it right now that I'm hearing. And what did we hit 45,000 fatalities last year, give or
Yeah,
take?
it's in that range. It was dropping into, we're down around
Yeah, it was like
38.
38 or something. It was massive increase.
We were saying, okay, what are we going to do to just eliminate this completely? Vision zero. No one no one talks about that anymore, and it's very sad.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. Because every person is somebody's mother, somebody's father, somebody's son. Yeah, every life impacts a number of other people. So we talk about technology and emerging technology. There's this new conversation with AI, new being like maybe 3 to 5 years. It's kind of like that next buzz of like what's going to advance data analysis in the United States. And we use data and AI every day here at Phoenix. But what do you see with this AI in terms of data analysis, well, data analytics and improving the quality of transportation data, maybe identifying outliers, or from your perspective, where does AI fit in the data analysis for transportation?
I think it fits a lot of places, and I want to give you what I would call an easy example, a very solvable problem that we face in the industry I'm in. When if we're trying to help investors decide whether to invest in shipping companies or port terminals, one thing we want to know is what's in the containers that are coming in
Mm,
to the port of Long Beach, the port of New York, the port of Savannah. And there's public data available about that because you have to fill out a manifest for customs purposes and say, is this got TV sets or does this have um, apparel or whatever? And so there is tremendous trade flow data out there. And the reason I'm using this example is because it's a very achievable way to use AI to make things better. So what's the issue with this data? A lot of the data is things are typed in and, in some database in some clear format, but some of the data is not. Some of the data is somebody in Malaysia wrote free form some text about what's in that container and perhaps in handwriting.
yes.
And so the only database is not a number that says this many kilos of apparel versus this many kilos of that, but just some handwritten description of what's in there. And so one of the things we're doing, at my firm is using AI to read free-form text about what's in a container and translate it into actual data that you can compute. It's a very simplistic example and it uses AI to do it. But the reason you should use simplistic examples of how you can use AI is, is so people can see, don't start with the biggest problem. Start with problems that are simple that you could get a graduate student who can come up with a way of saying, here's a massive freeform text data that nobody can use and turn it into analytical data that people can use. That exact kind of analysis could be used to make our safety data better. Police officer writes down some text about what happened, and that never makes it into databases because nobody translates the text into numbers. And AI for example, could help in that. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is AI being used to prevent crashes from happening. understanding in autonomous, understanding or semi-autonomous, how to prevent the crash from happening. That is also incredibly valuable, incredibly more complicated to do. But you don't need to wait for that, you know, nirvana solution of AI used to its full potential. Sometimes just start with the simple applications of AI that can help us a little bit.
Yeah, I think those are two fantastic examples of really understanding and looking at what are those different dimensions of how this technology can be harnessed in a safe, efficient, effective way that will also help our economy, that will also make our roads safer. So thank you for that, Peter. All right, last question, jumping into our time this morning. For transportation and local government professionals, what advice would you give on advocating for comprehensive data that reflects roadway and transit safety concerns to specific underserved populations? And how can they work to eliminate the biases in current data safety practices?
I think you can't just be reliant on what I would call top-down data, big national data sets. You also have to get data at the local level, and you need to understand how to overlay local data, which very well might be qualitative data, with more standardized, broader data sets. So, for example, if you have an underserved population. From the census perspective, they often refer to them as undercounted populations because they're very often the same groups. Same groups that are underserved are also they don't fill out their census forms, and because there are definitely communities that are either harder to find to fill out census forms or naturally skeptical about filling out government forms, and so the Census Bureau, a lot of what the Census Bureau spends money on every 10 years in the decennial census is the exceptions, the folks that didn't go out the form, going out and finding them, or using analytical techniques to fill in the gaps. And you're never going to get perfect data that way. So why am I talking about the underserved or undercounted populations? Because traditional data collection techniques might not work, which means you need to go to supplementary techniques. And maybe that means go to community organizations, go to churches, sit down, have focus groups with populations in the communities you're trying to help. Get right in front of a group of 20 people and talk about what they face day to day. That is data. That focus group that you're having with 20 people that might not have ever filled out a federal form in their life, that is still data. And collecting data at the local level requires sometimes very creative ways, very often ways that might be seen as more qualitative, but in reality can help bolster your quantitative data.
Yeah, I think with this National Institute of Health project that we're working on right now in Dallas and Detroit, we just completed two focus groups completely in Spanish, trying to understand the barriers of residents who are monolinguistic in accessing their transportation in their community, whether that be public transit, Medicaid, you name it. And it was fascinating to hear the conversations and the concerns and the challenges that residents are having in even navigating their healthcare ecosystem. And, when you say translators are available, but to have somebody naturally speak the language and hear that whole conversation in Spanish versus somebody go "Rrr, rrr, rrr," and then you don't know what they said, and then the translator translates it, and then it goes back and forth. But to have that full Spanish immersive conversation really brought that rich data. And I think taking what you said one more step further is getting that church and then have a member of that local church build that relationship, understand what are the unique things in that community that need to be understood and factored into when providing or trying to access the under the qualitative data. There has to be that person who the organization that serves as that local champion in providing that context if you're not from there. I'm from Nebraska. I'm not from Detroit. I'm not from Dallas. But when we go into the community, we work with somebody who grew up there or who's lived there or who's worked there for a number of years and been in the trenches and understands what are the legal challenges, what are the cultural nuances within each community, because it's not I mean, it's definitely a continuum. It's not a one, oh, well, this is a community that's Arabic and it's all the same, or this is a community that is Spanish or Hispanic. It's all the same. That isn't, I've never seen that. But so many times there's this monolith of how this community operates, and it's not a true narrative. And so to really have those deep conversations and get that data with context and clarity, I think it is so important to go where they naturally or feel comfortable or safe, but also have somebody who can provide that supportive translation, if you will, literally, but also culturally, to help you understand what that data is saying and what that means, from a federal perspective versus a local perspective. So I 100% agree that, having that data is great, but getting that qualitative information to supplement, or getting that qualitative or quantitative data locally is uh, absolutely vital to understanding what's happening in the community and why. All right. So as we close up this interview, Peter, I always like to ask some rapid fire questions, just to kind of end the conversation, kind of a fun note. So from your perspective, fill in a blank or answer each of these questions in a minute or less. Mobility equity is.
Mobility equity is critically important to economic opportunity for all.
Amen. Absolutely. I could not agree with you more on that one. What is the one piece of leadership advice that you think is so great, everybody has to hear it, or so awful you need to warn us?
I think that you need to understand the overlap between an organization's goals and individual passions and goals. An organization wants to achieve certain things, and an individual employee is passionate about certain things. And when you find the overlap between what the people in your organization are passionate about and what you want to achieve as an organization, it becomes very powerful. And there's often a lot more overlap than you realize.
Yeah, that is a phenomenal statement. I think a lot of folks maybe don't ask that question enough, especially in the interviews or early on in your job applications. Why does the mission of this organization matter? And when I think of the folks at Phoenix who've been here the longest or through all of the ups and challenges of a young emerging organization, it's those folks who had this deep ingrained understanding of perspective and passion for mobility equity that have really powered through and ridden the storm and seen the sunshine and gotten through that. So I think, taking that to that next step is, work at an organization that has the same mission and passion that you have, or try and work in organizations that have the same mission and passion and that career success. If you love what you do, and you do great work, and it keeps powering forward. All right. Something fun. What is the last TV show you binged on and loved?
Oh, the last few weeks, Drinking with Jason Segel and Harrison Ford. I'd never heard of it before a couple months ago. Now I've watched every episode. It's wonderful character development, really good writing.
I love Harrison Ford. I'm gonna have to check that out. I haven't heard of that before, so now I've got something on my Netflix list for the holiday break. Favorite concert of all time?
Springsteen, Boston Garden, 1992.
I can only imagine how amazing that was to be there and hear the sound and the lights and the just yeah. I'm
I saw him again 2 months ago in a
Oh,
30
really?
was it 32 years later, and, he still got that. I wish I was taking care of myself as well as Bruce has in the last 30 years.
Well, it's a gift. It's a gift. We'll go ahead. If you could wave a magic wand, Peter, and solve one aspect of inequity in transportation, what would you fix and why?
I think getting public transportation where it's needed.
Mm,
As public transportation has a time and a place to be built, and unfortunately, the things that cause it to be built in one location versus another location are not always based on true need. They're often based on other aspects, politics, cloud. And and so there are communities that by every metric really need public transit and don't have it just because they perhaps didn't have the advocates they needed to.
yeah. Yeah. That. Agree. If that could be fixed, we would have more economic opportunity and we would have more access to healthcare. It'd be a completely different society in some communities, especially. All right, final question. What is the one thing that you think is significantly under-discussed in the transportation industry that not enough people are talking about?
Just going to come right back to where I was a few minutes ago. Distracted driving is a much bigger problem today than people realize. The fact that they're not talking about it as much as they were a few years ago doesn't mean it's going away. Quite the opposite. We need to put our focus back on how to address this issue and save some lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wise words, Peter. Wise words. Well, thank you so much for your time this morning, Peter. I know it is early and it has been just such a great time to have this conversation. Your advice, your insights, your feedback have been invaluable. So thank you so much for joining us on the Phoenix Insider.
Valerie, thank you so much for offering your time to have this great discussion. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on the Phoenix Insider, where we explore the road to mobility equity together. Don't forget to subscribe and share this episode with your network to keep the conversation going. Together, we can break down transportation barriers and create lasting change. Visit phoenix.org to find out how you can help improve access for everyone. We'll catch you next time on the Phoenix Insider as we continue driving forward toward a more equitable future.